And we'll wait 1 minute to get started for people to join us, and then we'll begin. What's fun about the virtual conference, you know, like when face-to-face conferences, like you walk in the room and you could see how many people there are going to be. And then with this platform, where it's just like the attendee list keeps rising, it's awesome.
I've mostly gotten used to this format now. Mostly.
So I want to capitalize on our time and thank you everyone for choosing our workshop, Walking the Fine Line. I'm Amanda Sake. I'm the Director of the Office of Consumer Affairs, and I'm going to give a brief overview of what we'll be covering today, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. So just a little bit of background. Lived experience of recovery from behavioral health conditions is prevalent among people working in a variety of roles throughout our system. And regrettably, the presence of stigma and discrimination leads to an ongoing us versus them mentality. It could create fear for practitioners who might be considering disclosing or using their histories as an advocacy tool to address structural inequalities and barriers to reform. So this panel features individuals who identify in both professional and peer capacities in a meaningful way. The panelists, Jeremy Ruling, Liz Breyer, Clinton Green, Jonathan Edwards, and Stephanie Bouillon will discuss the intersection of our varied entities and experiences, whether chosen or not, and explore the potential for system-wide advocacy by professionals with lived experience, and look at the potential impact of more people openly share their histories in the workplace. We're scheduled to go until 4, but we hope this sparks a continued dialogue beyond this conference. Regina Schoen, a statewide advocacy specialist at the Office of Consumer Affairs, will be monitoring the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end of the panel. So we look forward to your participation. And so we'll start off by introducing ourselves and answering the question, what drew us to the conversation and why it's important to us. And I'll start with when I was first introduced to peer support, I was eager to be trained in, to use my lived experience in my person-to-person work. I was excited to participate in peer support. And when I began sharing my story in training, I saw the impact of how sharing my story with non-peer identified professionals. We've been doing this workshop for several years, and my favorite part is when people come up to us after to share that they can relate to our stories and want to know more about how they can use their stories in their work. There's a lot of potential for systems change with sharing lived experience, and the panelists will describe these benefits later. So I'll first turn it over to Jeremy. So what brought you here today, Jeremy?
I really had nothing better to do today. You know, it's kind of a weird question without telling my whole story. It's hard to fully get at it, but what it really comes down to is that, you know, I've sort of had these two parts of my life, right? A part that was heavily dictated by lived experience and having significant adverse experiences with my mental health that really kind of shut me down for multiple years of my life when I was a young adult. And on the other hand, I had this career track that I got into after that point of time when I started being kind of on the up and up of trying to be a social worker. And I never really thought of those two things in the same box. I thought of them as two very separate experiences. Yet when I started working as a social worker, what happened was that I started learning about this whole kind of peer world. And as I was trying to prove myself to be a good social worker, which I was trying really hard to do, I found that often felt very unnatural. And yet, when I was talking to people who were peer specialists, who were representing peer services, and people who were really out of the recovery world, I immediately had this sense of feeling like I was at home and that I was connecting. And it took me a few years to really understand that disconnect and to start connecting those dots. And I had some mentors who really helped me with that, to really start understanding that my lived experience was relevant to the work I was doing, and that it was actually something that could inform the work I was doing in a significant way. And then I had the good fortune of falling in with Amanda and Liz in particular, who we started just having these conversations and realizing it was a very common experience that we all wanted to discuss together. And so I'm going to stop and let the next person speak.
Great. Liz, what drew you here? And why is this important to you?
You and Jeremy initially. So, you know, just to kind of jump off of what Jeremy was saying, I've been having this conversation for the last 20 years in one way or the other, I think. I didn't know when I first entered this field that this separation between, you know, who called themselves a peer and who did not was even a thing. It never occurred to me that there needed to be. I just saw life as being very fluid. You had many different roles, many different hats that you wore. And depending on, you know, what environment you were in, you may put one of them on, you may put all of them on. And I learned very quickly from the system and from academia, actually, that that was not welcome and that that shouldn't happen, and that your identity as someone with any type of experience of mental illness, trauma, substance use, the list can go on and on. You didn't share that if you were going to be in that professional role. You certainly didn't disclose it to the folks that you were working with, which is a separate conversation really from this one, but you also didn't share it with your colleagues, and you weren't open about it in the work that you did, and you didn't draw from it openly and acknowledge it in your support of others. And that had a really strong impact on my life. In fact, it changed the course of my career. I think I'm the only one now here not a social worker. And the reason why I'm not a social worker largely was because of those early experiences and how it made me want to find something else, because I didn't think I'd be welcome there. Now I know better. I mean, you all are my friends, and I've learned a lot since those early days, but that's what drew me, is I wanted to change this conversation. I don't like being put in a box and being told that I can only be this. I don't think most people like that. And I find connection and growth in many ways, largely from many of you here, most of you, all of you here, but from people from all different walks of life. And I think we're missing out if we don't embrace that.
Very well put. Quentin?
Oh, so I am a social worker by training. What brought me here, other than Liz and Amanda and Jeremy inviting me into this discussion, is my own struggle or balance between being a social worker and honoring peer values, as well as acknowledging my own mental health challenges, and how does that play into the work that we do, if it's relevant to the work that we do, and how do we use it in the work that we do. So, and that's what drew me to this. And again, I, as Liz said, like after we've done this training in a couple of different places, the number of people who are practitioners who come up to us, who may not be out, and I will acknowledge that Liz warned me, like once you're out, you're out.
People listen.
Sometimes I listen. But once you're out, you're out. And seeing how many others are potentially part of the community is what drew me here today.
Thanks so much, Quentin. Jonathan?
Hi, good afternoon. It's really a privilege to be on this panel and to be having this dialogue among my colleagues. What drew me to this conversation was attending a workshop about 3 years ago. It was the National Association of Social Workers, New York City chapter. It was held at Hunter College, and I attended a workshop given by Amanda, Liz, and Jeremy at the time by the same title, Walking the Line. And, you know, I was just astounded that there were people I could identify with, and, you know, that I wasn't this unique person sort of navigating different worlds, and that, you know, I really wanted to be part of the conversation. And I let Liz know that. And, you know, here we are 3 years later, and I'm here with you all. So I'm really
Sorry it took 3 years, Jonathan.
you know, systems change takes a long time, you know, and I just want to say, like, you know, because I'm standing among you all who navigate the delicate course, you know, of being a professional practicing through a lens of lived experience, you know, I hope that others will feel inspired to, you know, find their empowerment, to pursue their goals. You know, I just want to say that most importantly, the topic resonates for me because despite pathologizing beliefs, negative self-talk, external stigma, structural racism, and sometimes questionable coping skills, I've been able to pursue and to really attain certain goals. And I think that, like, if I can do it, that anyone out there listening with the right supports and resources can. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Last but not least, Stephanie.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Bouillon. So I guess I started working as a peer specialist in 2012 after, let's say, working towards my own recovery and being hospitalized inpatient when I was a little younger. I think for me, what drew me to this conversation was that recently I completed my master's in social work, in clinical social work. And while exciting and I feel very honored to have achieved this, there was something that really started during my schooling to come up. This idea of not sharing about yourself, not sharing about yourself with participants, not sharing about yourself with your colleagues. So my classmates would often kind of like whisper things off to the side about their own life experiences, kind of with a lot of shame and a lot of stigma associated with it. But they were all working towards this great goal and accomplishing things. And I think that's what led me to this conversation, that internalized stigma that keeps us from sharing things that could support other people in their recovery.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I'll throw this question first to Clinton. Can you tell us a little bit about how you use self-disclosure in your practice and in your work?
Sure. So my role right now is as a trainer for the Coalition for Behavioral Health. And I try to use self-disclosure in a very deliberate way. I usually ask myself 3 questions. And it's usually during the trauma trainings that I use the self-disclosure. One, who is this for? Is it for me, or is it for the folks that I'm supporting? So am I dumping because I've had a bad day? Or do I think it's going to help the folks that I'm supporting? 2, is it relevant to what folks are experiencing? And 3, do I care? And I want to be very, very specific. I want to clarify that. Like, whoever I'm training with, or whoever the audience is, if they went out on Times Square and screamed it, would I feel shame, regret, or anything about it? I also want to say, other than that, and that's my role as a trainer now, and that's how I use my self-disclosure now as a trainer in this realm, among colleagues, which I think is kind of where I think we're going to go in this training. It also has to do with trust. Again, it's those same sort of questions, those same 3 questions, as well as is the environment I'm in open to me having those discussions? with my colleagues. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add to any of that.
You know, you said something really interesting there, right, about trust. And it makes so much sense to me. And I'm actually, you know, it's funny because one of my roles, I mean, my regular role is I'm a program director. I don't think I said anything about my job at the beginning. I'm the director for the On Track New York program at MHA of Westchester. So it's a direct service running a team kind of role, but sort of one of my side ancillary things, and sometimes what I actually probably enjoy more is doing training also. But a lot of the training I do, you know, sometimes it's outside folks and in, you know, conferences like this, but I also do a lot of in-house internal training. So I'm actually training my own colleagues. And it's amazing, you know, even with people where I know half the people in the room and have interacted with them, you know, every time I'm standing up there and I decide, you know, this is the time that I need to sort of throw out something regarding my own lived experience. It feels like a risk every time, right? Every time it feels like I get nervous about it, even having done it for a lot of years now. Because I know there's a certain weight that kind of goes with that. And I do it because I think it's valuable. I think it's valuable for the people I work with to understand that, you know, the people they work with have their own lived experience, and that it's valuable for them to maybe feel like they can share something about themselves as well. But at the same time, it's, you know, is this going to change people's perceptions? Is this going to put, you know, a certain kind of discrimination or stigma towards me as someone who's, you know, unprofessional? And I still have that fear every single time I do it, but I keep doing it.
And I think it's,
I think yeah.
I definitely think it's important. I also think, Jeremy, as a person of color and all the stigma and cultural beliefs around mental health challenges, for someone of color to be open about it also has a potential to reduce some of that stigma that you're referring to, not just the career stigma, which is real, but as well as some of the cultural stigma. So,
yeah, definitely. I certainly appreciate, you know, that challenge.
So I really like that framework that you both proposed. And Stephanie, congrats again about becoming a social worker. And so curious to know, how has your view of peer values changed as your career has progressed?
Sure. So more recently, I've been asking myself, am I being true to my role as a peer as I further my career, right? So I often find myself thinking about just how it is that I'm working towards supporting recovery, because I've been able to kind of reconcile the fact that social work is still person-centered and trauma-informed, and so is peer work, right? So with that being said, given that I'm currently in a peer role as a coordinator of employment at Howie the Harp Advocacy Center, a lot of what I do is not so much about, well, it is emotional support, but emotional support in helping people towards, let's say, regaining their sense of self and finding employment and working towards their self-identified goals. And I think for me, touching on what Clinton was saying earlier, I think self-disclosure has been really important. So I use more of my peer lens when I'm thinking about when people tell me that they can't do something, or that they are afraid to talk about their lived experience when it comes to work or when it comes to finding employment, or how to disclose appropriately to an employer. And then also how to use your lived experience as an asset, how to use it to really like bolster yourself as someone who has this profound experience that is not, you know, easily replicated through academic experience, right? So that's something that for me has definitely made it really, really powerful, I think, as well. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no.
Sure.
I was eager to hop on, but please continue.
Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead. Thank you.
So I appreciate that perspective of values. And if it's okay, wanted to throw this to Jonathan. Do you have an example of where you felt you needed to reconcile peer support values and the traditional helping profession values espoused by clinicians?
Yes, thanks, Amanda, and congratulations again, Stephanie. I don't think we can say that often enough. It's I've walked that path before, and I probably wasn't half as courageous as you were, but really great to have you in the professions among us. So, in thinking about that question, and I, was looking at the outline before, and I was like, whoa, do I even remember my own question? Because it got cut off, and I said, wow, I better hurry up and fix this because I could barely remember. But I felt it was important to first clarify the question, and I'm going to rephrase it as like, have I ever been in a situation where I felt like I needed to walk the line and embrace the values of peer support and clinical approaches simultaneously? And yes, often. And, I want to start out just by saying, like, we're often held to what is expected of us in our designated roles rather than working together with someone or a system to collectively agree on what might be the best form of support. And so I think there's always an expectation that, like, you're either one or the other, or you're a sellout, or you're this or that, or, you're two-faced, or, you're spineless, all these other, wonderful affectionate terms. But, like, one of the things I found, like, it's critical for the sake of the person receiving services and for the system delivering those services to seek alignment wherever possible. It doesn't mean that we agree on everything. Sometimes I like to call it the crosswalk. Like, where can we find the things that are, like, so yes, you as a clinician, you have empathy. As a peer, I have empathy. As, a clinician, like, you want the person to feel empowered to want the best possible outcome. I want that too. It may sound like really Pollyanna and simplified, but it's not. And I think it's a walk, it's a dance, and you do it while you're walking the line. So yes, I've oftentimes felt like I needed to fully support the folks that I was working with, the peers that I supervised, and at the same time, like, build those alliances with, like, other clinical staff. And then in terms of, like, where do I even identify? So I chose, like, not to call myself anything because I didn't want to say, well, I'm an LMSW or an LCSW or a PhD or whatever. And at the same time, like, I did not want to lead with my peer experience as though that was all I was representing. And it's a hard thing to say because it almost sounds like I'm trying to disavow that, and I'm not. It's just that one of the things that happens to us in being labeled and sometimes wearing those labels is that we limit ourselves. And a lot of people don't realize that, like, it's possible to go back to school and to struggle like most people going back to school as an adult and still be a peer and not lose your peer support values. But want to sort of open up your options. And, I just am glad that we have 88 people here, because if there's one person out there who wants to pursue their goals but kind of feels conflicted, it's okay. It is conflicted. It's going to feel conflicted. It's going to feel conflicted after you've gotten those pieces of paper. It comes with the territory. And what a wonderful line to walk, the conflict of just wanting to help someone and different people telling you how you should do it, but also knowing what's in your heart. So yeah, I do experience that a lot.
Oh, that's so powerful. Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's a continued walk on that line. So if more people in the traditional provider or professional role were to share their own lived experience at work, what changes would you expect to see in their immediate environments as well as within the larger communities? And I'll throw that one over to Jeremy.
Okay, I'm going to just jump on the bandwagon for a second here, and congratulations again, Stephanie. And also I want to say congratulations to Jonathan, because he got a doctorate recently. Which, like, wow, that's a big degree that sounds like I would be scared to go after it. But Anyway, so with that question, I mean, I guess what I really sort of think about is, but before I was in my current job, I was working at what's called the Sterling Community Center in White Plains, and I was director for a lot of my time there. And before I was director, I was sort of like the in charge of all the direct services. So I was like semi-director, if that makes sense. Um, and one of the things that kind of happened there early when the director who was above me had just taken over is she did this thing where she kind of stepped out and immediately said like, hey, I'm a person that identifies as a peer. I'm a person with significant lived experience. I'm also licensed as a mental health counselor. So she actually is someone who belongs, sort of in this same kind of conversation we're having. And she said it to the people who were receiving services at the community center. She said it to the staff. And what it immediately did is sort of normalized this experience and normalize this idea that someone in a leadership position could be a person with significant lived experience. A lot of the staff, sort of started coming, out in these little conversations here and there and said, well, actually, I never really talked about it at work that much, but, I had this happen to me. The people who were at the community center sort of started to change their own perspectives and relationships with how they were interacting with the community center staff, because there was suddenly sort of this more personal connection. And you really saw how that, sharing of lived experience and that really that just like humanization, right? And that openness created a different kind of communication pattern there. And one where people were able to kind of honestly talk about their own situation, what it was, what it wasn't. We all recognized we didn't have the same experiences. We didn't have the same backgrounds. We couldn't all say like, oh, I understand exactly what you're talking about. Because, we can't, right? We can only speak from our own experiences. And so, but we can then learn from each other's about, sort of what makes our experiences similar and what makes them different. And, how can we learn from the similarities and how can we learn from the differences? It really got to, and it was interesting because we were one service in a larger agency, but, we're kind of a larger visible service in a way. And I think we were a staff that maybe made a little bit of noise sometimes in the larger agency. And so you started seeing things kind of happening a little bit outside of just the Sterling Community Center. And in larger MHA of Westchester, you started sort of seeing people wanting to sit down and talk about lived experience. You saw people being open in trainings. You started seeing sort of meetings pop up where people could honestly discuss trauma. You started seeing, a more of an actualization of recovery-oriented values in a way that maybe weren't quite there before. And it's that us and them mentality, right? The idea of like, over here is providers, over here is service recipients, over here is peer specialists. It seemed like there's just less of that. And there were more honest conversations. There were more, open ideas. There was more collaboration. Liz and Amanda have heard me talk a million times when we did this more in like a PowerPoint fashion, right? That, there's this thing called social identity theory, which is that we as human beings, in order to sort of, be able to cognitively understand ourselves, we put ourselves in groups, right? New Yorker, Democrat, Republican, Yankees fan, Mets fan, and you can come up with a billion different groups that we might organize ourselves into and identify ourselves, to kind of take on, I'm a parent, right? That's a group. Racial groups, ethnic groups, nationalities, we can go on and on. And, part of that is kind of just to keep ourselves organized and to sort of make sense of the world. But at the same time, it also creates this division, right? Where it's this group is pitted against this group. And, we hear all the time about identity politics right now in the media. And, identity politics is that very thing, is people in different groups sort of exaggerating the differences between themselves and downplaying the similarities between each other. So, it seemed that a lot of those identity factions really evaporate for a period of time, at MHA, when people were just sharing more personally about their experiences. And it also, now if you're thinking about the recovery story of your colleague, instead of thinking of it as someone who you have to write a treatment plan for or something like that, it starts to feel more human also, right? Because there's kind of this invisible wall between us and people we provide services to, even as we're trying to bring that wall down. The different roles create distance and make us sometimes feel safer, but it also can lead to not treating people as humanly or as fairly as you would if it was someone who you were working alongside.
Very true. I'll go through the next question to Liz. Jonathan wanted to chime in on this thread.
Oh, sure. Very quickly, and thank you, Jeremy. You had mentioned the word advocate, and it occurred to me like there was something I wanted to say about, advocacy and like walking that fine line and what advocacy looks like. And you talked a lot about the silos and people being over here and these different camps. And like often I find that we get caught up in advocating for the person rather than advocating with the person. And then the focal point becomes like, who's right and who's wrong. And like we forget about the person that we're trying to support. I think it's vital that people feel empowered, like not to be treatment compliant, but to understand what their needs are, what they want from us, how we can best help them to get it. And I just want to take full responsibility for saying, like, I feel it's important to try to build alliances within a team rather than to alienate people, because then you really do lose sight of the person. And just, several of the ways that I think we can do really great advocacy within a system is how we tell our own stories. And it's not just, as Clinton said earlier, like dumping it, but like really using that strategic moment. Jeremy talked a lot about, taking the risk, but it's also such a vast opportunity. And I think I have to kind of do the same examination as if I'm working with someone else who, is a peer. Like, am I going to share my experience because I'm feeling the need to sensationalize, or is it really the best possible moment for me to share that? And always understanding that it's taking a risk, but ultimately I'm not responsible for what you think of me, but I'm responsible for trying to use my experience in an optimal way to help someone else. And lastly, to share information with people, to share literature, to share research, to be open to other perspectives, and to learn to listen to people even when they're not in agreement with us. Because I think it's very easy to like push away opposing approaches and just sort of say like, we're right. And it's really, really important to have that dialogue and to also sometimes agree to disagree. So thank you.
That really resonates with my day-to-day. So thank you, Jonathan. So Liz, how can those in traditional professional roles use lived experience to help foster systems change?
Oh, how much time do we have? There's a lot of different things.
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So I have been in both roles. I've been first in, a more traditional professional role 20 years ago when the concept of a peer was really only evolving in the state of Florida specifically. It wasn't something that was a part of services for sure, and it wasn't something a part of the regular conversation. Because of the way that my life played out and because of how some of the things that happened to me happened publicly, disclosure wasn't even an option. I didn't have a choice. It was just out, and that was kind of it. And as a result of that, I got to see the way that professionals changed towards me when I suddenly became a client, as opposed to just being their colleague who was running programs where, 6 months prior to that, I was being asked to run programs without even having a bachelor's. That's how competent they thought I was, although that was wrong and never do that. But that's what was happening. And then I suddenly, didn't have that confidence. They didn't have that confidence in me. So when I think all these years about some of the things I've heard said to me from multiple sources, either it's been, you're not sick enough, so, or you're too high functioning, or almost patting me on the head. I mean, that's the level of condescension I've heard sometimes. In fact, Clinton and I do those trauma trainings through the center. And, we have this conversation often. When I disclose, it's intentional. I'm not giving specific details about my trauma history. I talk in very global ways. But the comments, one of two things happens. It's either that resonating and those folks will want to come and talk to us afterwards, or I get told I'm very brave and get dismissed. It's almost like this disconnect happens instantly, like, well, you can't go there. We can't do this. We can't allow that level of vulnerability because we've all been trained to not do that. So when I think about what we could do that would be different, it really has to do with this system. I think wonderful people are drawn to this field in a variety of ways, and no one comes to this field to hurt anyone. That's never the intention. But I think we have policies and procedures in place that do. And as a trauma survivor, as a staff who wasn't out initially, I was asked to participate in some things that traumatized me because it came way too close to my own history. I don't think we should ever be putting our hands on people. I think that putting people into restraints is probably one of the worst, most traumatic things that we can do to somebody, particularly with a trauma history. And being asked to participate in that as someone with a trauma history, and we know, although finding research about it is difficult because people don't disclose, but we know just based on the general population, most people have a trauma history of some type, and most people in our field do. And I'm not talking about people who openly identify. So to have these types of policies and procedures in place when we know that we would not benefit from them personally, I think is one way that we could be making some great change. We can draw from what we know and really create a system that actually seeks to heal, not re-traumatize. Even in our trauma trainings, we're always talking about we need to not re-traumatize, but then we put things in place that re-traumatize staff that are even separate from vicarious trauma, just deliberate acts that we do, the more coercive things that we do, the level of cooptation, taking people's rights away. I feel like my passion is starting to rise up because it's been such a difficult line to walk. And I have finally been able to separate myself from that. I think when I think about the values I most identify with, it tends to fall on the consumer ex-patient survivor side, although that is not my personal experience, but in terms of values and perspectives, I gravitate more towards that. That resonates more with me. And I've learned so much from people who are in that group who share. I've learned so much about what helps and what hurts and what's necessary. Also, because I am a high-end user of healthcare myself, just the thought, Jonathan, you had said earlier about, aligning whenever possible. My personal opinion, it should always be possible. It's myself, it's my body, it's my spirit, my soul, all of that you are interconnecting with. That means it's my choice. So that alignment should always happen. And I realize I'm speaking from some level of privilege in many ways. But I still feel very strongly. Another thing that professionals can do is that we can open doors because of the power that we have. We can open doors of opportunity and create pathways for other voices besides our own. We can equal out that power differential. Yes, it's almost like the joke of, it's a given by your role, but we can even it out. We actually have the potential to really even that out if we choose to do that. I think if we listen and then take it past just listening to action and making the changes that people are recommending, that would also be a huge level of change. And we see bits and pieces of it, but we've never seen it consistently throughout. There's always that pendulum swing that happens, and that's with any system, I think. But after 20 years of doing this, I feel very strongly that because we do have the level of power that we have with these roles, with that comes responsibility to not do harm. And there's such beautiful ethics in all of these professions. You know, I'm not a social worker. I chose to get my master's in health advocacy. Maybe you can tell that a little bit by the way I'm talking. But I think that there is things put into place to keep us on track and to keep us mindful of who we are and what our roles are and what our responsibilities are. But sometimes that system is just bigger than us. So we have to push back on it pretty hard. So these are the things that I think of when I think about what could be different.
Yeah, it's always so powerful. And I see a lot of my role as, okay, as many seats as we can bring to that proverbial table and just constantly like pulling up those chairs is a very powerful thing that we can do. So I was very excited. So I want to start with Clinton wanted to chime in, and then Jeremy.
Sure. I wanted to just briefly touch on that intersectionality piece that Liz spoke about, as well as the condescending piece, right? So I'll do the condescending piece first, and that'll be really quick. It's like, oh, you guys you've done so well. Good for
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Huh. And at the same time, those might be the same folks who come up to us after the training to talk to us about their experiences. So there's that duality as well. Yes, you're such an exception. Yuck. As well as how do you manage all the pieces that you are? Do I have mental health challenges? Yes. Are there other things that give me advantage despite my primary identities being not advantageous in the country? And yet there are places where I have advantage in recognizing that and reconciling that, despite everything that is happening. It's challenging for me at this time to reconcile all that, as well as some of you pointed out earlier, the risk. I think it was Jeremy. The risk of like, how do I expose myself, right, to this? Because once I put it out there, I can't take it back. Right. Once I say that I have mental health challenges, once I say whatever the other things that I'm working with, I can't, once it's out in the universe, you can't take it back. And that's a risk. And it's a brave risk to take. And again, it should be done either with your especially with your colleagues or supervisor. And I know there are lots of worries about those, and I don't want to take up a lot of time with this. But it's something to consider, although studies say, it was a small sample size, that it was a study done by Temple, that the majority of people who disclosed to their colleagues and supervisors, 2/3 experience positive or neutral results from their disclosure. So something to think about for those of us who are thinking about, who aren't quote unquote out. And yes, microaggressions are something to think about, and I feel them and I hear them from lots of my identities, and but if it's about your mental health challenges, it's not something most folks, the research has said, um, works out as badly as we believe it would.
Such a good point, Clinton. And then I just want to reinforce, yeah, that when making this decision and intentionally using your experience, you always, the value of mentorship and peer support and cultivating that narrative is so incredibly important. It's almost like it'd be negligent to just start throwing stuff out there without asking yourself those questions or receiving that support. So this is the path I'm going to take us. Jeremy wanted to chime in, and then Jonathan, and then we'll conclude with the question, what are we hoping will be different as a result of this conversation? And then I want to open it up for comments from folks. So Jeremy, Jonathan, full group, sound good?
I had wanted to jump on something Liz had said, which had to do with that, piece of like empowering others, right? Which, to sort of step into my my social work role for a second here, it is something that when you go through social work training and you read the code of ethics and all that kind of stuff, we as a profession are supposed to empower others, right? It is a core central idea. And so, I think it's just like so important. And I think actually peer specialists are also supposed to empower people as well. That's actually in the peer ethics. So, how do we do it, right? And so part of it is that, and it is to sort of recognize where we're at, right? What power might we have in our respective roles? What privilege might we have in our respective roles? And what do we do with that? Have lived experience that kind of is what it is. And I'm going to be the first person to stand up and say, if I were to refer to myself as a psychiatric survivor, that would be absolutely disingenuous, because that's not what my experience is. I was not locked up forcibly against my will, right? I was not put in restraints. I was not hospitalized at all. I managed to avoid that particular experience. So if I say that that's what my experience is, that's not telling the truth, right? And if I compare my experience directly as a one-to-one kind of thing with someone who has that experience, that's insulting to what that person went through and what they had to deal with. However, that doesn't make my own experience or anyone else's own experiences insignificant, right? Part of the way power and privilege works is that, various kinds of privilege that I had when I was struggling allowed me to have the right kind of supports that did not lead me down the road to an emergency room. Had I been led down that road, it is possible I could have been hospitalized at that time. And, I was having a lot of suicidal thoughts during that time in my life. I was really not living as, out in the community. I was kind of just like holding up in my apartment the majority of the time. I wasn't socialized, it was what it was. And I had people around me that said, like, don't panic, Jeremy, we know that you're a good person. Jeremy, we know that you have a lot of strengths. Jeremy, we know that, you're going to get through this, and we need to just keep throwing, ideas and possibilities at you and just be there for you when you need us. Not everyone has that, right? And a lot of people who are in our services are there for that exact reason. So we need to be able to use this. And by the way, this applies not only to like, mental health, right? This is big with everything going on when power and privilege type situations come into play. Certainly it's very prevalent in terms of race right now. In saying, our role calls for us to lift other people up. you can't lift people up, you know, with the expectation that you still get to hold on to all of your power, right? You have to lift people up with the expectation of you're going to share that power, right? You're going to help other people to, you know, enjoy the kinds of platforms that you might have access to, and take a step back with the understanding that we're in this role because we believe in, you know, better services, better, you know, I mean, not to be like over global, but kind of a better world for everyone. So, I mean, I think it's so important that we recognize, you know, how to share that power and how to use those sort of professional identities that have more power to lift up people who are the day-to-day peer specialists and say, hey, this person has really good ideas. Maybe we need to start listening to them, right? This person understands things in a really deep way. What can we do with that?
I really appreciate that, Jeremy, and I want to welcome Stephanie's cat to the panel. That was awesome. So Jonathan wants to chime in about intersectionality, and then I'll move us to all answer the question, what are we hoping can be different as a result of this conversation?
Okay, thanks again. So yes, Clinton, when you first mentioned intersectionality before, and then of course that expanded because Jeremy, just listening to you, thank you so much for calling us into, you know, power sharing and recognition of privilege. And, you know, I have to say that, like, even as an older gay Black male, you know, with these labels and experiences, that I still glean the privilege that I have. And the reason I wanted to talk about intersectionality just very briefly is because just imagine the person who is showing up for support and services. They're not only dealing with the mental health stigma, the stigma of, you know, substance misuse, but, you know, just imagine that person, you know, sort of being different from what's considered the norm, being older. Oftentimes when I feel these things, the microaggressions, the minimization in the workplace, the silencing that, you know, it's very, very difficult to prove. That's in the nature of microaggressions, is like, these are things that we cannot really prove, but, you know, it's how things land or how we're not included. And whenever I want to kind of go to that place of feeling a little sorry for myself, I really have to think about people who are really disenfranchised. And it's not to minimize my feelings or my experience, but to say, what more can I do as an older gay Black male, who I may not always lead with that, but I'm just wondering if there are any people listening here today who, like, are terrified to come out of the closet, or, you know, ashamed because they're in their mid 50s like me. And like, when I was younger, I was like, how can people feel ashamed about being, well, sometimes the shame is something that we pull from you know, externally, like, you know, you're not included in certain things. You're not told about certain things. You're not included in decisions. You know, you don't fit into the young hipster culture, you know, in your workplace. And it could be very, very hurtful. But I always have to remember that part of my recovery is that regardless of how I feel, I always have the opportunity to help someone. And that's my recovery mantra, is that, like, I can feel like manure, but I still have the option to help someone and sort of be on that ongoing journey of healing my own feelings. So it was just really important to say that. And thanks, Clinton, for bringing that up, because there's so many expectations of us based on what we look like and our skin color and our sexuality and our age. And that all kind of folds in as additional layers to everything we're talking about.
Yeah, so many layers. So it's 3:40. So again, I'm going to take 10 minutes and then we'll open up the Q&A. And again, thanks, Gina, for keeping track of it. So leaving this conversation today, what are we hoping to be different as a result? And I'll start with Stephanie.
Sure, I guess so. From what I've heard, there was something that really resonated with me about this idea of being afraid to kind of share parts of ourselves with people and the vulnerability associated with that. I think for me, a takeaway for me is that a part of my role is to kind of work to be comfortable with that discomfort and to know that it doesn't mean I'm unsafe as I work towards kind of sharing some of my lived experience with folks as necessary and when appropriate, right? And I think like what could be different, I think just really striving to be okay with sharing the parts of ourselves that and sharing parts of our recovery narrative that can help people. Yeah.
Thank you. Well said. Liz, what do you think?
I think a lot of things. I have to say, though, just to give some respect to Stephanie, because just listening, even when we were doing the prep work for this, just listening to her perspective, I had not heard that for a long time, the place where you were coming from, of being able to help open those doors for people who didn't feel comfortable saying these things out loud. It's so long overdue. So thank you. Really, thank you. I think what I would like to see be different would be less rigidity, less clinging to, I guess, the ways that we've been taught things have to be, and being open to possibilities of things being different. Because, I mean, I hate to keep bringing Clinton into this, although you experienced it too, Amanda, when you were at the coalition. Always when we try to broach this subject with a room full of clinicians, there is the hand that goes up that says, but we were taught this. And yes, that's true. We were all taught a lot of things. But one of the joys of life is that nothing's permanent and everything is fluid, and we can be flexible about things. So I look forward to that. I think it's starting to happen, but like everything else, change can be slow. So
yeah. I remember that hand very well in the training.
Yeah.
So I'll go. I do not miss that moment. So I'll. I do miss training. So I'll go Clinton, Jeremy, and then Jonathan.
Sure. So I do want to thank, actually, Stephanie for introducing me to like true peer values when we work together, and helping me be more comfortable in myself, and being able to express that. What I've also seen, hopefully what we're going to see going forward, is that COVID and all the stuff that we're experiencing now has pulled back a lot of the Band-Aids in our society. So a lot of the us versus them, that line has gotten thinner and thinner and thinner, which would hopefully help, one, practitioners do some self-evaluation, self-reflection, as well as being able to better empathize with the folks that they support.
I want to, before I throw it to Jeremy, I want to share a quote. So at the Office of Consumer Affairs, we did a survey for people who receive OMH services and families on the impact of COVID. And there was one comment that just stuck out, and it was it was in response to like, how can OMH better support you? And the individual wrote, well, now I think the professionals, now that they know what we're going through, so maybe they won't make me feel so bad about being paranoid and sad anymore. It was like, you know, if anything, that breaking down that barrier, and I'll do my answer now. It's just that's what I want to see as our continued results. So Jeremy and Jonathan.
Yeah, and I mean, I really appreciate everything that everyone's saying right now, and thank you all. You know, thank you, Stephanie, for talking about opening doors for people. Clinton, thank you for talking about that empathy piece, and Liz about, you know, sort of, you know, what were the things that we were taught. You know, we all work, whether we're in a peer role, whether we're in a social work role, whether we're an administrator role, whether we're on training role, right? We all work in this thing called human services. And to me, you know, this conversation is so important because what is the tool that each of us has to work with? Our primary tool is ourselves, right? Even if we're not using lived experience as our primary tool, we're still using ourselves, right? We're using, you know, our ability to connect and relate with other people. How do we do that, right? If we can't have sort of this reckoning with our own humanness and you know, this ability to look at each other for our own humanness and our strengths and our challenges and all of the things that, you know, that make us, you know, different, wonderful, diverse people. I think as we sort of break down some of these like constructs of, you know, everyone having to be competent and professional all the time, it allows us to get to that empathetic place that Clinton was talking about in a much better kind of way. And, you know, the other thing is, I think in training, right, you know, we want to help change the narrative that goes with people are trained. And I hope this conversation helps with that. You know, it doesn't say, right, in the social work code of ethics, it doesn't say you are never allowed to share your lived experience. It doesn't say that anywhere. Now, there are a couple of like other weird little things that I can see why people might be cautious about it. But, you know, when I was in social work education, I found out that not all the professors had the same attitude about, you know, self-disclosure and if you should or shouldn't do it. Yet people come out of school with this idea that I was taught I should never disclose. Why is that? And how do we help change that?
Yeah, gosh, we could go on for a whole another hour about all those little things with social work. Jonathan, what are you hoping to be different as a result of this conversation?
Very simply that, you know, more and more people will feel empowered to, you know, share their experiences and to use their experience, you know, judiciously and strategically to, you know, help other people to feel empowered to make systems changes. You know, I also hope to do a better job, you know, using my lived experience, whether my title is peer specialist or program director or researcher, to just, you know, find as many opportunities as possible to help someone else to find their own empowerment. And, you know, and also just, I'd love to see more peer support workers involved in research. You know, the adage, nothing about me without me, or nothing about us without us. I'm a real proponent of participatory action research and really think that we need to be more involved in, you know, sharing our narratives and sharing our stories and our experiences with others. So I would really, really like to see that happen as a result of this conversation.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Research is so powerful in system change efforts, and if we're using our lived experience to help craft that narrative and bringing people with that perspective, it's just takes us to a whole new level. So thank you. Okay, so I've been watching the clock more than the comment box. So Gina, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, and let us know if there's comments or questions for the panel.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So our first question is from Annie, and forgive me if I mess up folks' names. Annie Leavitt or Levitt. Her question is, how much disclosure is too much? We want to establish trust with the people we're helping, but how can we do this and protect ourselves at the same time?
Sure. Can I know.
Yeah.
So
Liz
hand.
and Clinton.
You didn't
Yeah,
get the buzzer
whose
quick
hand was
enough.
first? She did get the buzzer
That's
before
okay.
you. So
I'll let you go.
Liz,
Yeah. I could say age before beauty, but you know.
We need to get those buzzers for panels. That's awesome. Okay, Liz and Clinton.
But again, it goes to the three questions I talked about earlier, right? Who's it for? Am I giving this because I want to unload, or is it going to be relevant, which is 1 and 2? Is it relevant to the person I'm supporting? Who's it for? And lastly, do I care whether they shout it from the rooftops, right? If that last question, at least I know for me, was the most important. And that is what helped me decide whether I want to talk to my colleagues, let alone the people I support, about the challenges, any challenges that I was going through. Now, Liz, because you were second to the buzzer.
That's right. I think my opinion is different because when I have this conversation, I'm not talking about disclosing to the people that you're working with. I'm talking about that general disclosure for the sake of the systems advocacy, for creating that warm work environment where people don't have to feel shame because they have issues, where clinicians don't feel that they can take a day, take a mental health day because they have an issue that they're needing to deal with. And so we feel that we have to lie and not be able to say, you know, I'm really depressed today and I think I need to regroup. We're not given that freedom. There's not a lot of care taken for our needs. And so I think from that respect, there's no limit to how much you can disclose. Again, it's not about the specifics. I'm not telling people every, horrible thing that happened to me in my life, but it's more about the general, I'm dealing with all of this as well. And here's how this can be different. They just seem like different conversations to me, I guess.
Okay, let's take another question.
Oh, I wanted to just, Amanda, could I just throw in one last thought on that question? And I'm going to be super fast with this. The other thing with that whole, how much is too much disclosure? The thing I always just like to remember is people do have a right to privacy. And that includes if you are a peer specialist and you've never been in a social work or other role. Just because you have a job where you use your lived experience doesn't mean you have to share every part of yourself if you don't want to. You get to choose what parts of yourself to share.
So true. Okay, Gina.
Okay, our next question is from Karen Schoen, or Schoens. Hi, Karen. Can you share any experience with providing peer support where the model or approach you used did not feel like it fit with your personal experience or cultural background?
Stephanie.
I guess so. When I'm thinking about my upbringing, I'm Afro-Caribbean. Talking about some of our challenges was allowed, but kind of in a complaining way. We can complain about the things that have happened to us. We can kvetch about our life experiences. But I think when it came to actively seeking out recovery, it kind of made it a little bit of a challenge when I was first learning about peer support. My first role as a crisis respite worker in New York City. I had to grow really accustomed very quickly to thinking about how I share my experiences. So like Clinton said, it's not like I'm sharing for the intention of unloading on people, but sharing for the intention of supporting people. Yeah.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. We're going to take one more question, Gina.
Okay, from Richard Lauder. Don't you think it's good that therapists don't disclose and peers do? Peer social worker is a whole new profession per Lyle Schmers. Sorry, I know I'm butchering that name.
I know Richard personally, so I'm going to answer. Hi, Richard. I personally don't think that that's good. I also think that the word peer sometimes can be has been co-opted and is used in very specific ways that it wasn't intended to be used initially either. So I don't think that it's a good thing that therapists don't disclose, but again, to whom and when and how and for what reason. If a therapist is using my time that I'm paying them for to talk about themselves, I'm going to be pissed. But if a therapist is using their own experiences to make the world a better place, I have no issue with that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and I'm going to co-opt right here as a social worker, and a therapist, that self-disclosure is something that social workers are not trained how to use, and at the same time, it's not something that is not a powerful tool, right? Just not trained how to use it. It's not in the same realm and same impact of what peer supporters can have. So I'm gonna leave that there, and any of my other colleagues have any thoughts?
Just throwing the ball on over to Jonathan.
Yeah, Clinton, I think we were talking over each other before. We must have sounded like the same person because you kept talking. Just wanted to say that I think disclosure can be one of the most powerful tools, whether you're, wearing the hat of a therapist or you're, working as a peer specialist, because I think it's a way of helping someone to feel connected. And as Liz said, I'm not paying, to hear your, travelogue or your life experiences, in excess. But I think for someone to say, yeah, I can identify with that, or when this happened to me, it helps you to feel less alienated and more connected. And I think, I always say the strategic and judicious use of disclosure can be one of the most powerful tools. And I try to apply that regardless of what chair I'm sitting in or what office I'm working in or what hat I'm wearing.
That's so true. So, this was such a great discussion, and over the years we've talked about how can we bring more people into this conversation, how can we spread the word and engage more folks, and so put my email address in the chat box, and we look forward to hearing from you, and we also look forward to continuing the dialogue. And many, many, many thanks to Stephanie, Liz, Jeremy, Jonathan, Clinton, and Gina.
All of you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you
And
everyone
Eileen,
on the panel and everyone who is spent time listening to us.
Yeah,